It was 3:47 inches the morning on a Tuesday when James Chen found her. He had been driving a taxi in Seattle for 11 years. He knew the city in the way that only people who work the night shift know it, the particular texture of 2 a.m., the rhythm of drunk college students and insomniacs, the specific corners where people made decisions they would spend years regretting. On this particular Tuesday, James had picked up a passenger at a hotel on Pike Street, a woman maybe 30 years old, wearing a dress that was too nice for a Tuesday morning. She had given him an address in a neighborhood that was 10 minutes away, and then she had not spoken for the entire ride. When they arrived at the address, she had asked him to wait. She had gone inside the building for 40 minutes. When she came back out, there was a car seat in her hands. The car seat had a baby in it, a newborn baby, maybe 2 weeks old, wrapped in a white blanket, sleeping with the particular peacefulness of infants who have not yet learned that the world could be difficult. The woman had set the car seat carefully in the back of James's taxi. She had said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I can't do this, please. Please take her to a hospital or a police station. Somewhere safe. Somewhere they can find her a family." James had said, "What? Wait." But the woman was already walking away. She was walking very quickly. And then she was in another car, a black sedan that James had not noticed before, and she was gone. James sat in his taxi with the meter still running and a newborn baby in the back seat, and no idea what to do. He did not take her to the hospital. He did not take her to the police station. These were the decisions that would change both of their lives, though he did not know that yet. Instead, he took her to his apartment. James Chen was 34 years old at that moment in time. He had never been married. He had never wanted to be married, though he had dated, and some of those relationships had ended because the women wanted children and he had been uncertain about it. He was not uncertain anymore. When he arrived at his apartment with the baby, he did what any rational person would do in a situation for which there was no rational response. He looked at the baby. He looked at his apartment. He looked at the baby again. The apartment was small. It was one bedroom, modestly furnished, the kind of place that a taxi driver who made decent money but had no dependents lived in. There were no supplies for a baby. There were no blankets except the one the baby was wrapped in. There was no formula. There was no diapers, but there was a phone. The first call James made was to his sister, Linda. She lived in Tacoma, 40 minutes away, and she had 2 children of her own. She was the person in his life who had experience with babies. "I have a situation," James said. Linda's response to the situation was what most people's response would have been. She said, "You need to call the police." James said, "I know. I will, but first, I need you to come over." Linda had arrived at his apartment at 4:47 inches the morning, still in her pajamas, with her hair wet from having just showered. She had brought supplies, formula, diapers, blankets, clothes in multiple sizes, because she did not know how old the baby was. She had looked at the baby and said, "James, you need to call the police. This is not a situation that you can handle on your own." James had said, "I will tomorrow. For tonight, I just want to make sure she's safe and comfortable. I just want to know that she's okay." Linda had looked at her brother for a long moment. She had seen him work taxi for 11 years. She had seen him be reliable and steady and kind to the people he encountered. She had never seen him uncertain. She had said, "This is going to change your life." He had said, "I know he did not know. Not really. He could not have known." The next morning, James called the police. A social worker had come to his apartment and taken the baby. She had explained the process. The baby would be placed in foster care. They would attempt to locate the mother. If the mother could not be found after a certain period of time, the baby would be available for adoption. James had asked, "Can I adopt her?" The social worker had said, "You can apply to be a foster parent. If you're certified as a foster parent, you might be able to take her in. But I want to be honest with you. You're a single man. You drive a taxi. There are other applicants who might be considered more suitable. But James had been determined. He had taken the certification courses. He had filled out the paperwork. He had submitted to the background check. He had done everything that was required. And somehow, he had been approved. The baby had come to live with him permanently when she was 3 weeks old. He had named her Sophie because it was a name that felt right to him, and also because the baby had had a silver bracelet when she arrived engraved with the letters, which suggested that the mother had at least given her a name, or the beginning of one. The bracelet had been the only thing the baby had from her previous life. James had kept it carefully, understanding that it might someday be the only connection Sophie had to her biological mother. For 7 years, it remained the only connection. Raising Sophie changed James in ways that he did not expect. He had not expected to become a person who worried about whether she was eating enough vegetables. He had not expected to become a person who attended parent-teacher conferences and listened to teachers describe his daughter's progress in reading. He had not expected to become a person for whom the most important thing in the world was a small girl's happiness. And yet, Sophie was a curious child. She was intelligent and observant and kind. She was also, as all children are, sometimes confused about why her life was different from the lives of her classmates. When she was 4 years old, she had asked him, "Why do I have a different face than you?" James had said, "Because I'm your dad by choice. You grew in a different woman's tummy. But you are my daughter, and I am your dad. And that's the most true thing I know." Sophie had accepted this. Children accept things that adults would spend years interrogating. When she was 6 years old, she had asked him about the bracelet. She knew it was hers. She had worn it sometimes, understanding without being told that it was connected to her origin story. James had said, "Your mom left you with me when you were very tiny. She left this bracelet so that someday, if you wanted to find her, you would have something that was hers. That was hers and yours." Sophie had said, "Do you think she wants to find me?" James had said, "I think she gave you to me because she wanted you to be safe and loved. And I think if she knew how much you are loved, she would be happy." This was what James had come to believe over 7 years. That the woman who had left Sophie in his taxi had not done it out of cruelty. She had done it out of desperation. She had done it because she could not provide what Sophie needed, and she trusted, somehow, that James could. 7 years later, James still drove a taxi, though he drove it fewer hours now because Sophie was in school during the day. He had built a life that was modest but full. He had built a life in which his daughter was safe and loved and happy. He did not know that his life was about to change again. Sophie was 7 years old when her school organized a field trip to the Seattle Art Museum. She was in 2nd grade. She was the kind of child who noticed things. She was quiet, but her quietness came from observation rather than shyness. The field trip was to see an exhibition about contemporary art. Most of the art did not mean anything to Sophie, or at least she did not know what it was supposed to mean, but there was one piece that stopped her. It was a photograph, a very large photograph. It showed a man and a woman in what appeared to be an office, and they were holding a newborn baby, and their expressions showed a love that Sophie recognized because she saw it in her father's face. The placard below the photograph read, "Untitled Found 2017 by Eleanor Thorne. Digital photograph, collection of the artist." There was additional text. It described the piece as part of a series about loss. It described the artist's exploration of absence and longing. Sophie had stared at the photograph for a long time. The teacher had said, "Come on, Sophie, we need to keep moving." But Sophie had said, "I know these people." The teacher had said, "You do, how?" Sophie had said, "I don't know, but I do." The teacher had moved on, and so had Sophie. But the photograph had remained in her mind. When she got home from school, she had mentioned it to her father. "There was a picture of a man and a woman and a baby," she had said, "and I think I knew them." James had said, "You probably just thought you recognized them." That happens sometimes with photographs. People can look familiar even if we've never met them. But something had shifted in James's mind. He had gone to the Seattle Art Museum's website. He had found the exhibition. He had found the photograph. The photograph showed a man who bore a striking resemblance to someone James knew, not just resembled, looked exactly like. The man looked like an older version of a person James had seen on television. In business contexts, a man named David Thorne, a man who had founded a technology company that had become extraordinarily successful, a man who was a billionaire. James had looked at the artist's name, Eleanor Thorne. He had searched for this name. He had found articles about an artist who was in a relationship with David Thorne. Articles that described them as partners in life and business. Articles that showed photographs of them together. In one article from 2016, there was a caption that read, Eleanor Thorne and David Thorne at the opening of the Seattle Innovation Center. The couple has been together for 8 years and announced their engagement last month. James had sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and the photograph from the museum on the screen, and he had understood. The woman who had left Sophie in his taxi 7 years ago had been Eleanor Thorne, or Eleanor Thorne had been somehow involved in Sophie's arrival. And the man in the photograph with her was David Thorne, and they had had a baby in 2017, the year Sophie was born. James did not do anything immediately. He sat with the knowledge for 3 days. He did not tell Sophie. He did not tell Linda. He did not tell anyone. He thought about the bracelet. He thought about the letters engraved on it. He thought about the fact that Eleanor Thorne had a name that started with E, not Ez, so the Ez must have stood for something else. A middle name, perhaps. A name that James did not know. On the 4th day, he hired a private investigator. He did not tell the investigator about Sophie. He told the investigator that he was trying to locate a woman who had once been a passenger in his taxi, and he had reason to believe that the woman was connected to someone in the Seattle tech community. He provided a physical description. He provided the date. He provided the photograph that Sophie had found. The investigator had taken 3 weeks to come back with results. The results were complicated. Eleanor Thorne and David Thorne had been in a relationship since 2008. They had married in 2015. In 2016 and 2017, they had attempted to have a biological child. Eleanor had become pregnant. But there had been complications during the pregnancy. The pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage at 6 months. The emotional trauma of the miscarriage had been significant. Both Eleanor and David had suffered from depression. Their relationship had been strained. In the months following the miscarriage, Eleanor had made several decisions that had concerned David. She had engaged in behavior that suggested she was not coping well. She had disappeared for periods of time. She had made statements about not being able to handle the idea that they would never have a biological child. In 2017, Eleanor had given birth to a child. A biological child, a daughter. But the child had been born through a surrogate, not through Eleanor's body. David Thorne had not known about this pregnancy. Eleanor had not told him that she had arranged a surrogate. She had kept the entire process secret. When the child was born, Eleanor had experienced a crisis of some kind. She had not been able to connect with the child. She had believed that because the child had not grown in her body, it was not really her child. She had believed that the child would be better off with someone else. She had given the child up for adoption. Or at least, that was what the record said. What had actually happened was that Eleanor Thorne had gotten into a taxi with a newborn baby and had given the baby to the taxi driver. David Thorne had found out about the child's existence only when the adoption process was finalized. He had wanted to find the child. He had wanted to bring her into their family. But by that time, the child had been placed with a foster parent who had been willing to adopt, and the case had been closed. All that remained was the photograph that Eleanor had taken at the hospital before giving the child to the taxi driver. A photograph of the 3 of them, Eleanor, David, and the baby holding each other. A photograph that Eleanor had titled, Untitled Found, and had spent 7 years processing through her art. The investigator had provided all of this information to James in a professional report, along with the clarification that David Thorne had no idea that his biological daughter was in the world. Eleanor Thorne had not told him. She had kept the child's existence secret. James had read the report 3 times. Then he had closed his laptop and had gone to pick up Sophie from school. Sophie had gotten into the taxi that James still drove on certain days, and had said, "Dad, when can we go back to the art museum? I want to see that picture again." James had said, "Sophie, can we talk about something?" Sophie had said, "Okay." James had said, "Do you remember the photograph you saw? The one with the man and the woman and the baby?" Sophie had said, "Yes, I still think I know them." James had said, "I think you might be right." Over the next month, James made a decision that would require him to betray a confidence, break a legal agreement, and potentially destroy a family. He decided to contact Eleanor Thorne. He found her email through the museum. He wrote her a message that said only, "I have something that belongs to you. Silver bracelet. The letter S. If you want to know more, call this number." He did not expect a response. He thought she might delete the email. He thought she might be horrified. He thought she might ignore it entirely. Eleanor Thorne called him 4 hours after he sent the email. Her voice on the phone was shaking. She said, "Is she alive?" James said, "Yes, she's alive. She's 7 years old. She's beautiful. She's kind. She's happy." Eleanor said, "Can I see her?" James said, "Before you answer yes, I need to tell you something. She doesn't know who you are. She doesn't know that you're her mother. She doesn't know that you exist. I have raised her for 7 years, and I love her more than I love my own life. And before I introduce you to her, I need to know what you want from her. Because if you want to hurt her, if you want to take her, if you want anything but her well-being, then the answer is no." Eleanor said, "I want to know her. I have wanted to know her every day for 7 years. I've been in therapy. I've been processing what I did. I've been writing about it, making art about it. But I've never stopped wanting to know her. Does she know that I chose someone good to leave her with? Does she understand that it wasn't about not wanting her? It was about wanting her to have a better life than I could give her at that moment." James said, "She doesn't know yet, but I can tell her, and then maybe we can talk about what happens next." James hung up the phone, and he sat at his kitchen table, and he cried. He cried because he loved Sophie more than anything, and he was about to introduce her to her biological mother, and he did not know if that would make her happy or hurt her. He cried because he was terrified. That night, he had sat down with Sophie, and he had told her the truth. He had said, "Sophie, I need to tell you a story. It's about the bracelet. It's about the woman who left you with me, and it's about why she did it, and what happened after, and what might happen now." Sophie had listened with the particular seriousness that 7-year-olds can bring to important moments. When James finished the story, Sophie had asked, "Does she want to see me?" James had said, "Very much. If you want to see her, I think that would be okay. But you don't have to. You can say no, and that would be okay too. This is your choice." Sophie had said, "I want to see her." "Is she nice?" James had said, "I think she is. I think she had a very hard time when you were born, and she made a decision that she thought was best for you. And then she spent 7 years being sad about that decision. But yes, I think she's nice." Sophie had said, "Okay, I want to see her." They met at a coffee shop in Pike Place Market, which was neither James's world nor Eleanor's world, but something in between. Eleanor arrived first. She was pacing nervously near the windows when James and Sophie entered. She was a woman in her 40s now, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and there was something in her face that Sophie recognized immediately. Eleanor saw Sophie, and she stopped moving. She simply stopped and looked at her. James had said to Sophie, in the car on the way there, she might be emotional. People sometimes cry when they meet someone they've been missing for a long time. That doesn't mean anything is wrong. Sophie was watching Eleanor's face with the observational quietness that James knew well. Sophie was seeing into Eleanor's heart, the way that children sometimes can. Eleanor had said, "Sophie?" Sophie had said, "Hi, I saw your picture at the museum," Eleanor had said. "You did? What did you think of it?" Sophie had said, "I thought it was sad, but also the sad part was okay because the people loved each other." Eleanor had sat down at the table. She had not taken her eyes off Sophie. She had said, "I did love you, even though I only held you for a few hours, even though I gave you to someone else. I loved you from the moment you were born," Sophie had said. "Why did you give me away if you loved me?" Eleanor had said, "Because I was broken, because I had wanted you so badly. And when I thought I couldn't have you the way I wanted, I didn't know how to be okay with having you a different way. And then, when you were finally here, I couldn't. I couldn't hold it all. I was too broken. But your dad, the man who raised you, he wasn't broken. He could love you the way you deserved to be loved. And I knew that even though it hurt more than anything I'd ever felt." Sophie had absorbed this. She had looked at James. She had looked back at Eleanor. She had said, "I'm glad you gave me to Dad, but I'm also glad I know you now." Eleanor had cried at that. Not dramatically, just silent tears running down her face while she sat across from the daughter she had given up 7 years ago. Over the next hour, they had talked. Eleanor had asked Sophie about her life. Sophie had told her about school, about soccer, about the books she was reading, about her favorite foods, about the way her dad knew how to fix almost anything because he worked on cars and taxis. At one point, Eleanor had said to James, "Thank you for raising her, for loving her, for keeping her safe." James had said, "She's my daughter. That's not something I need to be thanked for." Eleanor had said, "Still, thank you." When it was time to leave, Sophie had asked Eleanor, "Can I see you again?" Eleanor had said, "If your dad says yes, I would like that very much." James had said, "We can arrange it." In the car on the way home, Sophie had said, "Is Eleanor going to be my mom, too?" James had said, "I don't know what's going to happen, but I know that Eleanor is your mom biologically, and I'm your dad, and we both love you. How we figure out the rest, that's something we're going to work through together." Sophie had said, "I think it's going to be okay." 3 months after the meeting, Eleanor told David Thorne the truth. She told him that she had given birth to a child through a surrogate. She told him that she had given that child up for adoption because she was not in her right mind. She told him that she had found the child, and that the child was alive and healthy and safe. David Thorne's response was to ask one question. "Can I meet her?" Eleanor said, "I think that's up to her father, but I think he might say yes." James said yes. David Thorne was a man in his late 50s. He was a billionaire. He was powerful. He was the kind of man whose life had been built around control and certainty. And yet, when he met Sophie for the first time, he became uncertain. He had said, "Hello, Sophie. I'm David. Your mom told me about you. I wanted to meet you very much." Sophie had said, "Are you my dad?" David had said, "I'm your biological father, but I think your real dad is the man who raised you. I'm not sure what I am yet." "What would you like me to be?" Sophie had said. "Can you be my friend first, and then we can figure out the other stuff?" David had said, "I think that sounds perfect." Over the next year, Sophie's life expanded to include both of her biological parents. Eleanor and David's marriage, which had been fractured by Eleanor's secret, began to heal as they worked through therapy together. They began to understand the trauma that Eleanor had experienced, and they began to figure out how to include Sophie in their lives in a way that honored James's role as her primary parent. It was complicated. It was messy. There were moments when James felt territorial and protective of Sophie. There were moments when Eleanor felt like she was watching her daughter live a life with someone else. There were moments when David felt like an outsider in a family that he had helped create, but had not been part of. But there were also moments of genuine connection. Moments when Eleanor took Sophie to art museums and showed her how to see beauty and complexity. Moments when David taught Sophie how to think strategically about the world. Moments when James sat with Eleanor and David and talked about what was best for Sophie. and they actually listened to each other. Sophie, in the way that children do, adapted to all of this. She loved her dad. She loved her biological parents. She understood that the bracelet had been a bridge. It had connected her past to her present, and her present to her future. 2 years after the meeting in the coffee shop, Eleanor created a new art installation. It was called Untitled Found Again. It was a series of photographs showing Sophie at different moments. Sophie at school, Sophie with James, Sophie with Eleanor, Sophie with David, Sophie with all of them together. The final photograph in the series showed all 4 of them sitting together in Eleanor and David's home. Sophie was in the middle, and she was smiling, and everyone's hand was on her shoulder or her back. The placard below the photograph read, Untitled, Found Again, 2024, by Eleanor Thorne. Digital photograph. Collection of the artist. The artist wishes to acknowledge that this work exists because one person chose to be brave enough to believe that loss could become love. Sophie saw the exhibition at the Seattle Art Museum. She looked at the photograph of herself and her 3 parents. She looked at the placard. She said to her dad, "That's us." James said, "It is." Sophie said, "I like that. I like that the broken parts became the beautiful parts." James said, "Me too." 5 years later, Sophie was 12 years old. She was in 6th grade. She was a quiet, observant child, much like her father. But she had also inherited Eleanor's creativity and David's strategic thinking. She had developed a clear sense of what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to create art that told stories about how broken things could become beautiful. One evening, all 4 of her parents were in the same room: James, Eleanor, David, and Linda, who had become a significant part of Sophie's life and had understood early on that love for a child could expand to include many people. Sophie said, "I want to tell you all something. I want to thank you." James said, "For what?" Sophie said, "For trusting each other, for figuring out how to love me without destroying each other, for understanding that family doesn't have to look one way, for choosing every day to make it work." Eleanor said, "Sophie, we're the ones who should be thanking you for giving us a reason to become better versions of ourselves." David said, "What your mom said, times 3. Sophie said, "I also want to say something about the bracelet. It was the only thing that connected me to where I came from, and I think the bracelet was a symbol of something. It was a symbol that even when things fell apart, there was a thread connecting everyone. And eventually, that thread brought us back together." James looked at his daughter, this child who had arrived in his taxi as a newborn with only a silver bracelet for identification. And he understood that she had become someone who understood love in a way that most people would never understand it. She understood that love was not about ownership. Love was not about control. Love was about choosing, every day, to believe that the other person's well-being mattered more than your own need to be the person who was most important. It was the most important lesson she had learned, and it had come not from any single parent, but from all of them together.